The leather of the booth was old and deep red, worn smooth by decades of secrets. Alessandro Volpe sat with his back to the wall. Always. It was a rule etched in survival, learned on streets that had no name and taught with lessons that left scars. His restaurant Illinois Corvo was quiet on a Tuesday night. The clink of silverware on porcelain was a soft, respectable rhythm. The low murmur of conversation was the sound of his city breathing, a city he held in the palm of his hand. His world was one of order, of tribute paid and respect shown. His men, Leo and Marco, stood near the entrance, their dark suits a uniform of silent authority. They were shadows with shoulders, their eyes missing nothing. Sandro swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Ice rattled like bones. He was not a young man anymore. The lines on his face were a map of hard decisions and necessary cruelties. His hair was more silver than black, but his eyes were the same. Sharp. Unforgiving. The eyes of a fox who knew every trap in the forest. Then the bell over the door chimed, a sound too bright for the room. A woman stood there, hesitating on the threshold. She did not belong. Her coat was thin, her hands clutched a worn handbag like a shield. Her face was pale, etched with a fear and exhaustion that was out of place in the warm glow of Illinois Corvo. This was a place for the comfortable, the powerful, the protected. She was none of those things. Leo took a step forward, a polite but firm wall of muscle. The restaurant is closing soon. Private function. It was the standard line. The gentle dismissal. The woman flinched but held her ground. Her eye scanned the room, bypassing the few remaining patrons, bypassing the guards. They landed on him. On Sandro. She took a breath, a small, shaky thing, and walked toward his table. Leo and Marco tensed, ready to intercept. To remove the disruption. To restore the order. Sandro watched her approach. He saw the desperation in her walk, the way she moved as if the air itself was a weight pushing her down. He saw something else, too. A flicker of resolve that had no business being in a face so defeated. He lifted a single finger. A small gesture. Barely a movement. But it stopped his men cold. They froze, their professional instincts warring with the absolute authority of his command. The woman reached his table. She stood over him, her shadow falling across the white linen. She smelled of rain and worry. "Are you Alessandro Volpe?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. He did not answer immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze a physical weight. He nodded once. She opened her handbag, her fingers trembling. She did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, crumpled photograph and a single, folded bill. She placed them on the table. "I need to hire you," she said. Sandro looked down. The bill was $5. He almost smiled. The sheer audacity. The utter hopelessness of it. Then his eyes moved to the photograph. It was of a man, smiling, with his arm around the woman. A happy memory from a world Sandro no longer inhabited. His gaze drifted to the man's arm, to the faded ink on his forearm visible just below his rolled-up sleeve. It was a bird. A crudely drawn swallow, with a single star above its wing. The air left Sandro's lungs. The quiet restaurant, the clinking glass, the entire city outside his window, it all dissolved into a roar of white noise. His hand, the one resting on the table, began to shake. He curled it into a fist to hide the tremor, his knuckles white. He pushed back his own cufflink, revealing the skin of his forearm. There, weathered by time but still unmistakable, was the same tattoo. A swallow. A single star. The woman's eyes widened. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. A tear escaped and traced a path through the exhaustion on her cheek. "My husband," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My husband had that tattoo." Sandro looked from the ink on his own skin to her tear-streaked face. The world snapped back into sharp, painful focus. He reached across the table, his hand gentle, and pulled her into the seat beside him. A break in protocol so profound that Leo and Marco could only stare, their faces masks of disbelief. The untouchable Alessandro Volpe, the fox of the old quarter, had just let a stranger into his world. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next is a story about a promise made in boyhood and a debt that could only be paid in blood. If you appreciate stories about honor and unexpected connections, do me a favor. Like this video, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what we have coming. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it. Alessandro Volpe was a name spoken in whispers in the parts of the city that tourists never saw. He was a ghost story told to frighten ambitious young criminals. A legend. They called him the Fox because he never seemed to be where you expected him. He moved through the city's underworld with a quiet grace that belied his absolute power. His empire was not built on noise and flashy violence. It was built on secrets, on loyalty, and on the stark, cold reality that his word was law. If Sandro Volpe gave you his word, it was more binding than any contract signed by a judge. If you broke your word to him, your absence became a lesson to others. He controlled unions, logistics, and the quiet, unofficial banking system that kept the city's grey economy humming. He was a predator, yes, but he was a predator with a code. His territory was safe. He did not tolerate chaos. He did not permit harm to come to the ordinary people who lived and worked under his unseen dominion. Their shops were safe, their children could walk to school. This was his peace. A peace bought with the threat of terrible, precise violence. But this man, this monolith of quiet power, was built on a foundation of loss. Long ago, before the suits and the restaurants and the fear his name inspired, there was just Alessandro and Stefano. Two brothers, thin and hungry, on the forgotten streets of the old country. Sandro, the older, the protector. Stefano, the younger, the dreamer. They had nothing but each other. On Stefano's 16th birthday, they had sealed a pact. With a stolen needle and a pot of cheap ink, they had marked themselves. A swallow, for the journey they would one day take across the sea. A star, to guide them home if they ever got lost. A promise. Always together. Always brothers. Then, one night, Stefano was gone. There had been trouble. A small-time feud that had escalated. A knife. A chase through dark alleys. Sandro had been caught, beaten, left for dead. When he woke, Stefano had vanished. The official story was that he had fallen into the harbor during the chase, his body swept out to sea. Sandro never believed it. He searched. He raged. He tore apart the small world they had inhabited, looking for a trace, a rumor, a whisper. Nothing. The loss hollowed him out. It forged the boy into the man he became. The rage cooled into discipline. The grief hardened into a shell of control. He made the journey across the sea alone. He built his empire brick by painful brick, always fueled by the ghost of a lost brother. He never spoke of Stefano. The name was a locked room in his heart, the key long thrown away. The tattoo was his only memorial. A secret he shared with a ghost. And now, this woman. This widow with rain in her hair and $5 in her hand. She wore his brother's memory on a photograph. Sandro sat beside her in the booth, the red leather cool against his back. The restaurant had emptied. It was just them, and his two men standing like statues by the door. He gestured to the barman, who brought a glass of water and a small brandy. He pushed the water toward her. "Tell me," he said. His voice was softer than she expected. It was not a command. It was a plea. "My name is Elena," she began, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "My husband was Marco. Marco Rossi." Sandro's mind worked. Stefano. Stefano Volpe had become Marco Rossi. He had run. He had not died. He had run, changed his name, and started a new life. A life without his brother. A pang of something sharp and bitter, something like betrayal, struck Sandro, but he pushed it down. It was followed by a wave of overwhelming relief. He was alive. He had been alive all these years. He was a carpenter, Elena continued, her eyes focused on the worn grain of the table. A good man. The best man. He could make anything with his hands. He built our home. He built our life. She took a shaky sip of water. Last year, I got sick. The doctors, the bills, it was too much. Marco didn't want me to worry. He took a loan. Sandro knew this story. He had heard 1,000 variations of it. It always ended the same way. From who? He asked, his voice flat. A man named Riccardo Gallo, she said, the name a foul taste in her mouth. Sandro's eyes narrowed. Gallo. A vulture. A loan shark who operated on the fringes, a bottom feeder who preyed on the desperate. Gallo was not part of the old world of honor. He was new money, all greed and no rules. A man Sandro had long despised but had no business reason to eliminate. Until now. Marco tried to pay, Elena said, her voice cracking. He worked day and night. But the interest, it kept growing. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. Last month, Gallo's men came to his workshop. They said he was out of time. She stopped, pressing her lips together, fighting for control. They wanted to make an example of him. It was an accident, they said. A fight that went too far. But I know it wasn't. They beat him. He died 2 days later. Silence descended on the table. A heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. Sandro felt a cold fury begin to build in his chest, an old, familiar fire he had not felt in years. This was not business. This was not a violation of territory. This was family. Gallo isn't finished, Elena whispered, her last reserve of strength crumbling. He says the debt is mine now. He wants the house. The house Marco built for us. He gave me until tomorrow. He said if I don't sign it over, he'll come for me. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading. I don't have any money. I have nothing. But I saw your name once, in an old news article. It said you handled things. That you helped people when the police couldn't. She pushed the $5 bill across the table. It's all I have. Please. I just want him to leave me alone. I just want to keep my home. She looked at the tattoo on his arm again. Marco never talked about his past. He said it was another life. But he told me about the tattoo once. He said it was a promise he made to a brother he lost. A brother he thought was dead. The irony was a knife in Sandro's heart. They both thought the other was gone. 2 brothers, separated by a lie, living in the same city for decades, each mourning a ghost that was just a few miles away. Sandro looked at Elena. His sister-in-law. The woman his brother had loved. The woman who was now being terrorized over a debt that was meaningless. In her, he saw the life Stefano had chosen. A simple life. A good life. A life of love and honest work, far from the shadows Sandro had embraced. And Riccardo Gallo had destroyed it. He had trampled on the one pure thing that had survived from Sandro's past. The internal conflict was a storm inside him. For 30 years, he had lived by a code. Do not act on emotion. Do not engage in personal vendettas. Every move must be for the good of the family, for the stability of the business. Helping this woman broke every rule. It was personal. It was messy. It was pure, unadulterated rage. His entire life was a carefully constructed fortress of logic and control. Elena's story was a cannonball smashing through the walls. He thought of Stefano, the boy who would follow him anywhere, the boy whose laughter used to be the only music in his life. He thought of the promise they made, a childish pact that had become the defining tragedy of his existence. A star to guide them home. Stefano had tried to build a new home. And now Sandro had to protect it. The code be damned. The rules were for business. This was blood. He slowly, deliberately, pushed the $5 bill back across the table toward her. Then he took the photograph of her and Marco. He looked at his brother's smiling face. Older, lines of laughter around his eyes, but still him. Still Stefano. This debt, Sandro said, his voice a low growl. It is not yours. It is mine. Elena stared at him, confused. I don't understand. Your husband was my brother, he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with 30 years of silence. He stood up, towering over the table. He looked at Leo, who was watching him with wide, concerned eyes. The look on Sandro's face was one Leo had never seen before. It was not the cold calculus of a boss. It was the raw grief of a man. Leo, Sandro said, his voice dangerously quiet. Take her home. Put 2 men on her house. Nothing and no one gets within 100 yards of her. Is that clear? Yes, boss, Leo said, his voice tight. And Leo? Yes? Find out everything about Ricardo Gallo. His operations. His warehouses. His home. Where he eats, where he sleeps. I want to know where every rat in his saw is hiding. You have 1 hour. The command was absolute. 1 hour. An impossible timeline for anyone else. For Alessandro Volpe's organization, it was a challenge they would meet. Leo nodded, his face grim. He understood. This was not a business dispute. This was a death sentence. Sandro turned back to Elena, who was still sitting, stunned, trying to process the impossible truth she had just heard. He placed a hand on her shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of reassurance, but his hand trembled with contained fury. You will be safe, he promised. I give you my word. And in his world, that was the only guarantee that mattered. He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Elena in the care of his most trusted man. He stepped into the cool night air. The city lights blurred around him. For the first time in decades, Alessandro Volpe was not thinking about money, or power, or territory. He was thinking about a boy named Stefano. And he was thinking about vengeance. The plan was not complex. It was brutal. It was final. Sandro stood in the cavernous garage he used for business that couldn't be conducted in restaurants. The air smelled of cold concrete and oil. Leo stood before him, a tablet in his hand, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had delivered. In 52 minutes. Gallo's main operation is a warehouse in the industrial district, Leo reported, his voice clipped. He uses it for storage and collections. He has a crew of about 12 men. He's there now. They're processing last week's take. Sandro listened, his face impassive, a mask of stone. He lives in a penthouse apartment downtown. 2 bodyguards with him at all times when he's not at the warehouse. Tonight, he is at the warehouse, Sandro stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, boss. His men. Are they professionals? Leo scoffed. Thugs. Street muscle. They're loyal to the money, not to him. Good. That made it simpler. Sandro turned to the dozen men assembled behind him. These were not the polite guards from the restaurant. These were his wolves. Men who had been with him for years, men who understood the language of silence and violence. They were dressed in dark, functional clothing, their faces grim and ready. Tonight, we are not sending a message, Sandro said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. We are not negotiating a territory. We are erasing a mistake. He looked at each man, his gaze lingering, ensuring they understood. Ricardo Gallo and his entire operation ceased to exist. Tonight, we will go to his warehouse. We will be silent. We will be fast. The men who work for him get one choice, to walk away and forget his name. Those who resist, we make them forgotten. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Gallo, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper of ice. Gallo belongs to me. There were no questions. There was only the quiet, efficient sound of men preparing their tools. They moved with the practiced economy of soldiers. For black sedans pulled out of the garage, their engines a low thrum. They moved through the city's sleeping streets, a silent procession of ghosts on their way to deliver a haunting. Sandro rode in the lead car, staring out the window at the city lights. His city. Stefano had lived here, breathed this same air. He had probably walked these same streets. Maybe he had even seen Sandro's car pass by one day, never knowing it was his brother inside. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. The rage that had been a cold fire was now a white-hot furnace. The sedans pulled into a dark alley a block away from Gallo's warehouse. The engines cut out. Silence. Sandro and his men exited the vehicles, melting into the shadows. They moved like a single organism, a predator stalking its prey. The warehouse was a large, corrugated metal box under the sickly orange glow of a single security light. Two of Gallo's men stood by the main entrance, smoking, their laughter loud and careless in the night. Sandro's men split into 3 teams. One for the back entrance. One for the side. Sandro led the main team, walking calmly out of the darkness toward the 2 guards. They saw him approach, their laughter dying. They straightened up, trying to look intimidating. "Hey, old man, this is private property," one of them said, flicking his cigarette away. Sandro didn't break his stride. He stopped a few feet from them. Leo and 2 others flanked him, materializing from the shadows. The guards' confidence evaporated. They recognized the quality of the suits, the stillness of the men. This was not some lost drunk. This was trouble on a level they had never encountered. "We have business with Mr. Gallo," Sandro said, his voice calm. "He's not seeing anyone," the guard stammered, trying to hold his ground. Sandro simply looked at him. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked. And in that look, the guard saw his own insignificance. He saw an abyss of cold, final authority. Simultaneously, there were 2 soft thuds from the side of the building, and a metallic click from the rear. The other teams were in position. The guard's nerve broke. He fumbled for the handle of the door. The other guard was already backing away, his hands raised slightly. Sandro's men flowed past them into the warehouse. The interior was brightly lit. Piles of cash were being counted on folding tables. About 10 men were scattered around the room, laughing, drinking. At the center of it all sat Riccardo Gallo. He was a man who looked soft and vain, wearing a suit that was too flashy and jewelry that was too bright. He looked up as Sandro's men fanned out, sealing the exits. The laughter died. The room went completely silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Gallo stood up, his face a mixture of confusion and arrogance. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "You're interrupting my work." Sandro walked slowly toward him, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Gallo's men looked at each other, uncertain. They were thugs, not soldiers. They saw the discipline in Sandro's men, the cold professionalism. They saw death walking toward their boss. "Your work is finished," Sandro said. He stopped at the main table, looking down at the stacks of money. "The profits of misery. I don't know who you are, but you've made a big mistake coming here," Gallo blustered, trying to project an authority he no longer had. "This is my territory." Sandro looked up from the money and met Gallo's eyes. "Nothing in this city is yours," he said softly. He then turned to Gallo's crew. "Your employer's business is closed. Permanently. You have one opportunity to leave. Walk out that door and forget you ever knew his name. Your pay is on the table. Take what you've earned tonight and disappear. Anyone who stays has chosen to stay with him." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, one man, older than the rest, slowly backed away from his table, grabbed a single stack of bills, and walked toward the door. Sandro's men let him pass. That broke the dam. One by one, then in a rush, Gallo's crew abandoned him. They scrambled for the money they had counted, their loyalty lasting only as long as their fear of Sandro was greater than their greed. In less than a minute, the warehouse was empty except for Sandro, his men, and Ricardo Gallo. Gallo stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of his pathetic empire, his face pale with sweat. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, animal terror. "What do you want?" he pleaded. "Money? Take it. It's all yours." Sandro shook his head slowly. "I don't want your money." He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Gallo. He was a foot taller than the other man, a mountain of quiet menace. "I want to talk about a man named Marco Rossi," Sandro said. Gallo's face went blank for a second, then a flicker of recognition. "The carpenter?" He was a deadbeat. He got what he deserved. It was a business matter. Sandro's expression did not change, but a dangerous light flared in his eyes. "You sent your animals to his workshop. You beat a man to death over a few $1,000s. He owed me." Gallo protested, his voice high and shrill. "There are rules." "Yes," Sandro agreed, his voice a venomous whisper. "There are. And you broke them. You took a man's life. A good man. You terrorized his widow. You did this not for money, but for your own pathetic pride." Sandro unbuttoned the cuff of his shirt. He slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faded tattoo on his forearm. The swallow. The star. Gallo stared at it, uncomprehending. "His name wasn't Marco Rossi," Sandro said, his voice thick with a lifetime of grief and rage. "His name was Stefano Volpe. He was my brother." The realization hit Gallo like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He stumbled backward, shaking his head. "No. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." "You didn't know," Sandro repeated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You didn't care. To you, he was just another name in a ledger. A piece of dust to be swept away. But he was my blood." He stepped closer, backing Gallo against a stack of wooden crates. "You didn't just take a debtor's life," Sandro hissed, his face inches from Gallo's. "You took the last piece of my past. You took my brother. Again." Gallo started to babble, pleading, offering anything, everything. Sandro raised a hand, and the pathetic noises stopped. He leaned in, his voice so quiet only Gallo could hear it. "In my world, we have a word for men like you. Dishonorable. You have no code. You have no respect. And now, you have no future." Sandro stepped back. He gave a slight nod to Leo. He turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. He did not need to see what happened next. He already knew the outcome. As he stepped out into the night, he heard a single, muffled sound from behind him. Then, silence. Leo emerged a moment later, his face grim. "It's done, boss." "Burn it," Sandro ordered. "Leave nothing but ash." He got into the car. The problem of Ricardo Gallo was permanently closed. The debt was paid. He returned to Elena's house just before dawn. The sky was turning a soft gray, promising a new day. His men were still there, posted discreetly at either end of the quiet residential street. They were invisible unless you knew what to look for. He walked up the small path to the front door. It was the kind of house you saw in pictures of a life he could never have. A small porch, a swinging bench, flower pots waiting for spring. A home. Leo had given her a phone to contact him. She must have seen him arrive, because the door opened before he could knock. Elena stood there, wrapped in a blanket. She had not slept. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for an answer. He didn't offer platitudes or comforting lies. He just gave her the truth, simplified. "It is finished," he said. "Gallo will not bother you again. No one will." The relief that washed over her was so profound, her knees seemed to buckle. She leaned against the door frame for support. "How?" she whispered. "It does not matter how," he replied gently. "What matters is that you are safe." He held out a thick envelope. "This is the deed to your house. It is in your name. Free and clear. There are no more debts." His men had retrieved it from Gallo's office, along with every other predatory loan agreement he held. All those debts had vanished in the fire. She stared at the envelope, then back at him, her eyes filling with fresh tears. These were not tears of fear, but of disbelief. Of gratitude so immense it had no words. She didn't take the envelope. Instead, she looked at the $5 bill still clutched in her hand from the night before. She tried to press it into his. "Please," she said. "It's not enough, I know, but it's all I have. You must take something." Sandro closed his hand over hers, gently pushing it back. He looked down at the crumpled bill, then at the photograph of his brother he still held in his other hand. "You have already paid me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me this." He held up the photograph. "You gave me back my brother. That is a gift worth more than all the money in this city." He finally took the envelope with the deed and placed it in her other hand, closing her fingers around it. "This is his home. Your home. It is safe now. That is all the payment I require." She looked at him, truly looked at him, past the fearsome reputation he carried, past the violence she knew he was capable of. She saw the grief in his eyes. The profound, lonely sadness of a man who had lost everything and just found a piece of it again. "Are you a good man or a bad man, Mr. Volpe?" she asked, the question so simple, so direct, it cut through everything. Sandro was silent for a long moment. He looked at the peaceful little house, at the coming sunrise. He thought of the life of violence he had led, of the things he had done to build his lonely kingdom. Then he looked at her, the widow of the brother he had failed to protect. "I don't know," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "But last night, for your husband. I got to be the good man." It was the most honest thing he had said in 30 years. He knew he should leave. His world did not belong here, in the light of day, on the doorstep of a good woman's home. But he lingered. He pulled a simple business card from his pocket. It had no name, no title. Just a phone number. His personal number. A number known by less than 5 people in the world. "Your husband was a Volpe," he said, pressing the card into her hand. "That makes you family. The Volpe family protects its own. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call this number. Day or night. Someone will answer." It was a promise of absolute sanctuary. An invisible fortress around her and the life his brother had built. She clutched the card and the deed to her chest. "Thank you," she said, the words full of a lifetime of meaning. He simply nodded, turned, and walked back down the path. He did not look back. He got in his car and drove away as the first rays of the sun touched the rooftops, leaving the world of light for his own world of shadows. 1 year later. The flower pots on Elena's porch were overflowing with bright red geraniums. A small, tidy garden grew where there had once been bare earth. The house was filled with light and the smell of fresh baking. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. She was no longer just a widow. She was a woman who had survived. Once a week, on Tuesday afternoons, a black sedan would pull up to the curb. Alessandro Volpe would get out, dressed not in a sharp suit, but in a simple sweater and slacks. He would walk up the path and knock on the door. Elena would let him in, and they would sit in the kitchen, the one Marco had built, and have coffee. She would tell him stories about her husband. About his kindness, his terrible singing voice, the way he loved the smell of sawdust. She filled in the 30 years Sandro had lost. He would listen, his face a mask of quiet contemplation, but his eyes would hold a warmth no one else ever saw. He never spoke of his business. She never asked. They existed in this small, peaceful space they had created, a bridge between two vastly different worlds. He was not her savior or her boss. He was her brother-in-law. He was family. Miles away, in a high-rise office with a panoramic view of the city, Alessandro Volpe sat behind a large, empty desk. The office was minimalist, cold, a reflection of the man's public persona. There were no personal effects. No photos, no trinkets. Only ledgers, maps, and the tools of his trade. But there was one new addition. On the corner of the desk, in a simple, hand-carved wooden frame that smelled faintly of cedar, was a photograph. It was the crumpled picture Elena had brought to his restaurant. The picture of a smiling man with a familiar, faded tattoo on his arm. The picture of Stefano. The brother he had lost twice. Once to a violent night, and once to a life he never got to share. But now, he was found. In a world of shadows and hard choices, some debts can never be repaid with money. A debt of honor, a debt of blood, demands a different currency. Sandro Volpe was a man who understood this better than anyone. He learned that true power was not in the ability to take a life, but in the will to protect one. And that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you are willing to fight for, a promise made in ink and sealed in the heart, a star to guide you home, even after you think all is lost.